All right, today we're going to talk about intercoolers. Specifically, I'm just going to talk about air-to-air intercoolers. It's the most commonly done intercooler for street application. A lot of big horsepower drag specific are going to go air to water because they can get lower than ambient air temps. But with ice, of course. But for this, we're just going to talk about air-to-air. So first thing we're going to talk about is construction. The two common types are tube and fin and bar and plate cores. I'm not going to get into this too much, but you want a bar and plate. So there's a little picture I have here on the tablet, the main difference. So in the tube and fin, you have extruded tubes with the fins pushed in. Tube and fin sacrifices flow for more cooling, and bar and plate is more well-rounded. It also needs a very little external airflow. Sorry, there we go. Bar and plate acts more like a heat sink. So if you were to take two intercoolers of the same dimension, one was tube and fin, one is bar and plate, the bar and plate intercooler would be at least twice as heavy. It's going to have more aluminum. It's going to have more material. So it acts more like a heat sink. Needs very little outside flow to actually radiate and reject heat well. Because of the the fin density. So that's another important thing to look at. Over on the left, that's a really, less dense fin per the flow area, and there's a really dense one. So it's a balance on this. Most of the better cores, like Bell or Garrett, are going to have a higher thread density. Yes, this will flow better, but this will cool better. And in the end, if you size your intercooler property, you're going to want the more cooling with the better flow of the intercooler size. Vice, something that's not going to have a lot of pressure drop, but it's not going to cool for much at all. Kind of like tube and fin. Tube and fin restricts flow a lot for more cooling. Bar and plate allows for high flow, but not as good cooling. So yes, if you were to say technically a tube and fin intercooler cools better, but you don't want a tube and fin, especially for like a Century blower. When you have a fixed blower RPM and engine RPM and fixed boost, because it restricts flow so much to cool it down, you're going to see a huge pressure drop on a Century. A smaller displacement, higher revving turbo car can tend to take advantage of tube and fin, but usually they're running bar and plate these days anyway because of how little airflow from outside the core is needed to help it reject heat, if that makes sense. All right, so that's enough of that. Moving on. So talked about thread density. Typically, you want higher density. It's going to cool better while still flowing decent as long as it's properly sized. If your intercooler is too small, it's not going to work regardless. We'll get into that. All right, first I'm going to show you some really crappy air intercooler designs that I just looked up on the internet. So this intercooler it's technically, you would call it a dual pass. So it has two core, these end tanks are separated. It's passing through this whole core, doing a sharp 180, and then passing through the whole core again. These are horrible. Don't ever run an intercooler like this. Make sense? All right, couple reasons. One, you're restricting flow way too much. You're trying to get more cooling by doing a double pass, but you're restricting flow. It's a balance of flow and cooling. Don't ever run this, especially on a V8. You're gonna rob horsepower. I know there was a kit for the 05s that came out. I want to say it was like a Zimmer kit. It ran like this is something you'd see on like a 200 or 300 horsepower Honda. It ran something like this, and it was running like 20 pounds of boost, barely making 600 horsepower. It should have been at 800 plus because it was restricting flow so much by forcing all the air in such a small core, making it 180, and then making it flow through it again. Just doesn't work right. All right. So there's some crappy designs. So along those same lines, right? What's best? Some things to avoid. Same size inlet outlet, right? So if I have my core, right, I don't want to put an end tank on one side and then have any kind of configuration that has inlet and outlet on the same time, if I can avoid it. Which is kind of just an excuse. Some people are like, oh, it's easier to plumb if I have same size inlet outlet. Just don't do it. It is nowhere near as efficient. It will not flow and cool as well as a intercooler that flows across the core. All right. One, the dual pass thing, which we can get by that with a vertical flow. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the whole making the air do a 180, it just slows the air down too much. You lose flow, you lose efficiency. Because we're dealing in flow and cooling capability, we want to have a good balance. We want to maximize flow, and in turn, we will get the cooling efficiency we need by using the correct size core, right? So, same side inlet outlet, avoid at all cost. Just don't do it. Most engine bays you can do an across core intercooler pretty easy. The only one that you would want to do is a vertical flow. It would be like the lesser evil here, right? Typical vertical flow would look like that if I knew how to draw. You can do it, come on. Right, it would look a little something like that, and the flow is going this way. So you have vertical and horizontal. I'm not going to get into them. They can both do the same thing. In a smaller package, vertical tends to be a little better flow-wise. You often see vertical flow on superchargers because they have a limited flow since they're not wastegate operated. They're limited flow rates because there's shorter passages, right? So the air coming in has less distance to travel, so there's less flow loss restriction. While you can still run a good size length by width by thickness core to get the cooling you need. But what would be better than a same size inlet outlet vertical would be the opposite. Great. So even better, right? But these intercoolers tend to be a little more expensive, harder to plumb because you have an inlet on the bottom and the top. Usually you want them at the same level just for ease of plumbing on the car. And horizontal works just as well. It may not flow as good because it's flowing through a longer core. So the vertical core tends to have better overall like max flow because the runners in the core are shorter. And then it's going through a wider length of them. But I'll talk about, okay, like here's a core, and then you want to avoid sharp bends. Intercooler construction, avoid sharp bends, right? You want nice rounded areas, like that would be good. Or like if you have a bottom entry to the end of the core, right? You have these nice sweeping, curved things. That's what you want, right? You want to gently allow the air to come in and leave the intercooler. What you don't want to do is, real boxy, right? Stuff like that. Or like immediately turn corners. I get some cars have to do that for packaging, but you want to avoid it. The smoother your intake transitions, the better. And then we'll just look at the most common intercooler that you see that everyone uses. It has these nice sweepy end tanks like this, right? It has a good sized core, and it has a bottom entrance, which is great. And I'll talk about why this is great and maybe some reasons you thought weren't beneficial. We'll have to we'll dive into it a little more. So the biggest thing I see with this is people don't like, I'm putting the intercooler behind my bumper. It's blocking half my intercooler. Doesn't matter. Get to that in a second. Because essentially why that doesn't matter. First of all, we just talked about bar and plate. It's like a heat sink. It needs very little outside air flowing through the core to still reject heat very well. So the fact that that's blocked doesn't matter. If you look at the physics of frontal area for forcing air through an intercooler anyway, it's about a 25%. So you just want an entrance of your bumper to at least allow air to 25% of the intercooler, preferably where the air is passing through, right? So let me pull up a picture for you real quick that I got off the internet. Right. So there's like a thermal imager. Hopefully it's not too reflective. Let's move you down here. Of an intercooler, right? So hottest spot, cold, and then you kind of have like a gradient, kind of diagonal gradient going through. And then a bunch of that intercooler you wouldn't see behind the bumper. So like in this picture, this intercooler runs, you know, good 30% of it is hidden behind that bumper. But it doesn't matter, right? Because the hottest spot in that intercooler is going to be passing through the bottom. That's where you want your airflow at. And the cold part of the intercooler, where it's still cooling, but it doesn't need the airflow as like the hottest spot does. Does that make sense? So there happens to be the Roush bumper on my car. It has an entrance just to the bottom part of the intercooler where the air is flowing through. That's the hottest spot. That's where I have the outside airflow. So people think drilling holes in the bumper or opening up the bumper and letting air see the full face of the intercooler does anything. It doesn't do anything. It could actually hurt cooling because you want the outside airflow at speed focused on the hottest spot there. And you want ducting. So in this case, my bumper is very close to the intercooler face, so there's less than like a ½ inch room for air to splash around. So most of the air that comes through here is actually forced through the core. So it creates a high pressure area in front of the intercooler and a low pressure area in the back, and that's what promotes air flowing through the core, right? That's what you want. It's not super difficult. It's the whole reason intercoolers were designed like this with these bottom entrances and exits. It's for front mount. That's why they call it a front mount intercooler. It's meant to go behind your bumper in the front of the car. Your lower grill lets air into the hottest part of the intercooler. It works really well. All right, makes sense. And then now we're gonna get into some math. However, you're gonna like this math. It is super simple for saying how big of an intercooler do I need for my car. So this rule of thumb, I know guys, bear with me, it's going to be really difficult. So length of the core times height times width gives me my rough horsepower that intercooler will be efficient to. All right, super simple. So if I had, and I pulled up just to show you how that works, I pulled up a chart of some Garrett intercoolers, right? And it has the length, height, and width. I don't care about the weight for this. And then it gives me a rough horsepower, right? So I can pick out any of these numbers. So I'll just start, let's say I'll start with this 24.6 here. So it's on, calculator on, 24 inches long times 6.4 inches high, and it's 3 inches thick, and that gives me 460. And then if I look at 24, 6.4, 3 inches thick, 475. And it'll work for anyone across here. So I can skip down to one in the middle. Let's do this. Actually, let's go further down. So these like nearing 1,000 horsepower ones, right? So down here I got a 23.7 inch long core times 12 inch height times 3.8 thickness gives me 1080. And then on their chart, that 3.8 is rated to 1,000. So it scales. And that's rear wheel horsepower, right? And there are some things to consider. But that's the rough estimate. You can always have more intercooler than you need. Typically, if you're buying an off-the-shelf kit, the intercooler and the charge system will be built to support what that engine can support. So you might get a turbo or a blower that can support 600, 700, 800 horsepower, but the kit that supports it was only designed for 500. You know, it's got a 2.5, 2 3/4, 3 inch core. It's got smaller inlet and outlets. So look at my other video, right? So first you want to pick piping size based on the power you want to make, and then you can use this little guideline to get the core size you want to make. You can get a custom one, you can get an off-the-shelf one. That standard intercooler I had just drawn, oh man, you can get a USA made one, or there's a lot of imported ones that are cheap these days. So you don't have to spend 500 to 1,000 on a Garrett or a Bell core unless you really want to. Those are some of the best, but you know, Treadstone, CX Racing, a lot of these bar and plate, good fin density intercoolers are cheap. You can get them for like 200, 300 bucks, and they'll support a ton of power. But so that's up to you. Yeah, so super easy formula to help you pick. So when you see someone listening, and make sure you go off the core, right? That chart was all core numbers. I don't care about the length from inlet to outlet and like the end tank stuff. Go off the core size, and that'll give you a rough real horsepower on what that air-to-air intercooler will support. And like I said, that's really where it's going to be efficient to. You can still run it past that, usually 100 to 200 horsepower, and it's still going to be good. Just the more you run past that horsepower number, the more heat you're going to have at the outlet, if that makes sense. So when I designed my turbo kits, I knew I wanted them to support 1,000 horsepower as a kit. Don't care about the turbo, or even if it's a supercharger, I don't care about the supercharger. I wanted the charge size and the intercooler to support that. So what happened was, because the system supported a lot of power, and then guys that were, I only want to make 500 horsepower with it. They're running 5 pounds of boost, making 500 wheel, and IATs are ambient because of how efficient the cold side is. So you can never skimp on it. Really, for a V8, whether it's 500, 600, 700, you'll want at least a 3-inch core. Minimum, I would recommend just getting a 4-inch core. It's not much more expensive. So the intercooler I used in my kit had a core that was 24 by 12 by 4. So if I just do that rough math, 24 by 12 times 4 is 1,152 horsepower, right? It's essentially wheel horsepower in this scenario. So it was capable of way more than I ever planned to run through it. So I knew, regardless of turbo size on the kit, whether a guy was only running 5-10 pounds of boost, 5-600, or they were making 1,000 wheel with like a 76 millimeter turbo, it was going to be good. And then even on the twin turbo setup that used that same core, right? And then I sized the piping and everything, like in my other video for it. I had a 3-inch inlet from the turbo, 3.5-inch outlet of the intercooler, and 3.5-inch piping, because I knew I wanted to be in the same range. So my end tanks matched the size, and my piping was correct. The twin turbo car, we had one end up making some. We're not sure for certain. We imagine it made over 1,200 wheel, ran mid-8s at 160 plus mile an hour, because the charge size and intercooler was efficient for the flow and power I was at. So, and then my buddy's car, who was the first one to have that kit, he ended up making like 1,000 wheel on like 20 horsepower on 93 octane, because IATs were within 5-10 degrees of ambient at that power, which is ridiculous, but it's because it's efficient. So there, it's basically it. To recap, stay away from tube and fin, especially if you're on a Century supercharger. You're just going to lose too much pressure through the core. It slows flow down too much. Stick with a bar and plate. It's heavier. It has more material. It's like a heat sink. It's going to radiate heat. It needs less airflow through the core to cool well. You don't need to worry about your bumper. It's designed to be up front. If you do want extra cooling at speed, you can do some ducting from your lower grill to your intercooler. You don't have to cover the whole face. You want to cover the part that's hottest, right where the airflow is, based on that thermal image we looked at. So, and then super easy formula. If you see a core, if you're shopping around and you see one come up used, do that quick math. Don't go off what they're saying, right? A lot of times they'll be like, oh, this intercooler can support 500 horsepower, and then it's like a 2.5-inch core, and you do the math, and it's past efficiency at 300 wheel, right? Or it gives you like a CFM, but that's usually a max CFM, and you don't know what pressure that CFM's at. So just use this simple formula to get you in the ballpark. Don't forget, you can always have more air-to-air intercooler than you need. You're not going to lose anything as long as it's a good design. So even if I was only wanting 500, 600, 700 horsepower, I could run an intercooler this big. It would be super efficient. It would make good power, and I'd have low IATs. So there's that. Intercoolers, air-to-air. Not very complicated. Easy math. Have fun.